Hi there. Yesterday I talked about suffering and joy, and today I'm going to talk about a particular kind of suffering which is still very prevalent in the world today. I'm talking about the suffering of racism, and I was shocked to hear recently from a friend of mine, a young friend of mine, who told me that she experienced racism in the school she went to in Norwich. So Norwich is a predominantly white city, and Norfolk is predominantly white. I grew up in London. I spent about 30 years growing up living in London, and so a multiracial society was quite normal for me. And I was very surprised when I came to Norfolk how different it was here. So for many of us, racism is something that we hear about on the news. But for some people, including this friend of mine in Norwich, racism is a daily experience, or at least just the fear of racism. Where does racism come from? It may be some kind of, or it may originate in some kind of instinctual behaviour to do with survival. We see something which is different in some way and we react against it. But it's also very much to do with our conditioning. If we grow up in an atmosphere of hatred and aversion, then we will adopt those same attitudes of hatred and aversion. So we can learn racism from parents, from school, from other people's behaviour. And we can also learn hatred, aversion, racial prejudice. We can learn it from experience. And I want to be very personal now and talk about something from my own experience and how I had to really work with this in my mental states. So my experience, as I said, was that I was brought up in a multiracial society, and I had friends of different races. I played in bands with several black people of colour. So it seemed quite normal to me. And I used to walk around London streets, often by myself, and not worrying at all about who I was going to encounter on the streets and what it was going to be like. I was pretty fearless then, I would say. But then after I left London and came to Norfolk, I went back to London for a visit, and I was attacked by somebody. Now, it wasn't a serious attack in terms of physical injury, but it certainly marked my experience. You know, it was a shocking incident for me. Physically, I just had a pretty sore head for a few days afterwards. And I've no idea why this attack happened. Maybe it's just because I was a white guy and the guy who attacked me was black. So afterwards, I noticed that my former fearlessness in going around the streets had changed somewhat. I'd always be looking out for who was coming up on the street in front of me, and I'd be noticing what colour they were. By that time, this was the mid-1990s, by that time I'd already been a practicing Buddhist for quite a few years. So I was well used to noticing my mental states, trying to understand my mental states and working creatively with them. So I was able to perceive that there was unskillfulness in the kind of things that my mind was doing as a consequence of that attack experience. So I thought, right, I have to work with this. I have to learn to change that experience, because otherwise I'm going to fall into a very dangerous trap of assuming that any black people I encounter are dangerous just because of what happened to me. And it made me realise that racism or aversion of any kind or any unskillfulness actually can be learnt by experience if we're not able to work with our minds and nip such things in the bud. So that is what I was able to do. I was able to change the way my mind worked by recognising that actually it's ridiculous to make a generalisation that black people or white people or any kind of people are dangerous, because any kind of human being has the potential for any kind of behaviour, skillful or unskillful, good or bad. So I recognised that and was able to work with that in my mind. So it didn't take a hold. But that's an example of how I think racism, or indeed any kind of prejudice, can arise out of one's experience, whether or not it's already there in one's conditioning. So I think we need to look at our experience, look at our mental states, try and notice what kind of attitudes that we might have towards people that we perceive to be different in some way, whether it's racially different or sexually different in terms of sexual preferences, or any kind of difference, really. You know, if we're honest with ourselves, we can surely see that we have all kinds of prejudices, all kinds of likes and dislikes. We prefer certain kinds of people, and we don't particularly like other kinds of people. We make all these categories, don't we, in our minds. We make categories when we do metabhavana practice. For example, we categorize some people as being neutral, and it's very useful to be able to work with that. But really, neutral is just a label. We could even say it's a kind of prejudice, because really that person isn't neutral in any sense. They're not more or less significant than we ourselves are. It's just we give them that particular label because we don't know them very well. And also with the difficult person and the friend, you know, in a way those labels reflect our preferences, don't they? They reflect that we like some people and dislike other people. So metabhavana is an opportunity to be honest, to look at our mental states, to look at our preferences, and to think, well, is it really skillful to have those preferences? What can I do about those preferences? Do they need changing? So at the moment, in response to racism, there's the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very big, and it's not a recent thing. It's been going for a number of years now, I think about 5 years, in response to various racial acts over the last few years. And of course it's very worthy of support, but we have to choose individually how we are going to support that. Maybe we just support it by working internally with our minds, with our prejudices, as I've just been outlining, or maybe we are more active in our support for it. I think that's an individual choice, what we do there. But also it makes me think that actually Black Lives Matter, I'm really right behind that myself, but also I'm right behind White Lives Matter as well, and all lives matter. William Blake said, the poet from the 18th, early 19th century, William Blake said that every living thing is holy, or everything that lives is holy, I think was his words. Everything that lives is holy. So we could look at our lives from that point of view. Do we treat everything as if it were holy, as if it were worthy of respect and love? And I've always taken that phrase of William Blake's to refer to all kinds of living beings, but also less obviously living beings as well. For example, nature, plants, trees, the sky, the earth. So all living beings, all inanimate objects, all are worthy of our respect and love.